GM Lordstown Assembly Plant, Ohio, the factory that built the American dream and watched it die. On the flat plains of Ohio's Mahoning Valley stands a vast structure that once hummed with the sound of American industry. This is a complex story of the GM Lordstown Assembly Plant, a factory that promised prosperity, delivered decades of middle-class stability, and then became a symbol of everything that went wrong with the American manufacturing dream. At first, it was hope made concrete and steel, a state-of-the-art facility that transformed a rural community into a blue-collar powerhouse, where high school graduates could earn wages that bought houses, supported families, and built futures. Here, assembly lines ran 24 hours a day while the rest of America bought the cars they produced. But this plant was never just a factory. Within its walls gathered union workers who had the power to shape labor law nationwide. At first, strikes had stopped production and forced executives to negotiate. Then the plant passed through decades of layoffs, automation, and shifting corporate priorities. And Lordstown became not only a workplace for thousands, but also a symbol of deindustrialization, broken promises, and the anger communities left behind. In the same buildings where workers once fought for better wages and conditions, politicians now deliver speeches about economic revival. Venture capitalists make promises about electric futures, and former employees wonder what happened to the life they were told they could build. How did one massive factory transform from a symbol of American industrial might into an abandoned monument to globalization's casualties? And what truth is still hidden behind its locked gates and rusting equipment? If you enjoy deep investigations into American industrial history and the communities these factories shaped, please subscribe, and tell me in the comments which abandoned or transformed factory to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Part 1. The Valley That Made Steel and the Promise of Something More. The building rises from Ohio farmland like a monument to post-war optimism, a symbol transported from an era when American manufacturing seemed invincible. 1 million square feet of factory space, eventually expanding to over 6 million. Assembly lines capable of producing 60 cars per hour. Parking lots that could hold thousands of vehicles. This is a GM Lordstown Assembly Plant, built on land that once grew corn and raised cattle, transformed into an industrial complex that would employ over 10,000 workers at its peak. But before it became a cautionary tale, before it housed broken promises and desperate revivals, before the protests and the headlines and the political stunts, it was one region's answer to a question that haunted the Rust Belt. How do you survive when the industry that built your community starts to fade? This is the story of that factory. And the story begins, as so many American industrial stories do, with steel, massive amount of it, and the strange way economic transformation can lift an entire region and then, decades later, abandon it completely. Let us begin with the Mahoning Valley. The region stretching across northeastern Ohio into western Pennsylvania was, by the mid-20th century, synonymous with American steel production. Youngstown, Warren, Campbell. These cities house blast furnaces that had forged the metal for bridges, buildings, railroads, and 2 world wars. Steel was not just an industry here. It was identity, heritage, the bedrock of everything. But by the 1960s, cracks were showing, foreign competition was increasing, production methods were changing. The steel industry that had seemed permanent was becoming uncertain. Communities built entirely around steel mills face an uncomfortable question. What comes next? General Motors provided an answer. In the mid-1960s, GM was the largest automaker in the world, producing roughly half of all cars sold in America. The company needed manufacturing capacity to meet demand, particularly for smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles as consumer tastes began to shift. Ohio offered several advantages: proximity to steel suppliers, an experienced industrial workforce, and state and local governments eager to offer incentives to attract major employers. The location itself was calculated. Lordstown was a small, unincorporated community in Trumbull County, essentially rural land between Youngstown and Warren. The site was large, flat, and relatively cheap. More importantly, it sat near major transportation routes, highways, and rail lines that could move parts in and finish vehicles out efficiently. The decision to build Lordstown Assembly was made in 1964. Construction began in 1966. GM's plan was ambitious: create one of the most modern automated assembly plants in the world, a facility designed not just for current production, but for the future of manufacturing. The price tag was substantial, over $100 million, equivalent to nearly $900 million today. Construction took 2 years. Between 1966 and 1968, Lordstown transformed from quiet farmland into an industrial complex. The work was massive in scale. Concrete foundations poured across acres, steel framework rising into the Ohio sky. Assembly line equipment shipped from other GM facilities and new machinery, representing the latest in automotive manufacturing technology. Local workers found employment in the construction phase: electricians, welders, heavy equipment operators, laborers. The jobs paid well by regional standards. The promise was even bigger. Once the plant opened, it would employ thousands permanently. Stable manufacturing jobs with union wages, health benefits, and pensions. The kind of work that built the American middle class. The timing seemed perfect. The plant opened in 1966, just as the post-war economic boom was beginning to show signs of strain, but before the major recessions and oil shocks of the 1970s. America was still the world's dominant manufacturer. Automation was seen as progress, not threat, and the United Auto Workers Union, powerful and militant, ensured that workers would share in the profits they helped create. Lordstown's first product was a Chevrolet Impala, a full-size car that represented traditional American automotive tastes. But GM had bigger plans. By 1970, the plant had been retooled to produce the Chevrolet Vega, a subcompact car designed to compete with increasingly popular imports from Japan and Germany. The Vega would become legendary, though not always for the right reasons. It was meant to be GM's answer to the foreign invasion: small, fuel-efficient, affordable. Lordstown was chosen as the primary production site precisely because it was the most modern plant, capable of the speed and precision the Vega's design required. Production ramped up quickly. The plant ran 2 shifts, then 3. At its peak in the early 1970s, Lordstown produced over 100 cars per hour, more than any other GM facility. The assembly line moved at unprecedented speed. Workers had mere seconds to complete their tasks before the next vehicle arrived at their station. The workforce was young, many in their 20s, hired in massive waves to meet production demands. These were not the older, more conservative workers who had built the UAW in the 1930s and 40s. This was a generation shaped by Vietnam, civil rights, and a growing skepticism toward authority and corporate power. Tensions developed almost immediately. The speed of the line was punishing. Quality suffered as workers struggled to keep pace. Management pushed for faster production. Workers pushed back, filing grievances, slowing down deliberately, and in some cases, sabotaging vehicles on the line. Loose bolts, missing parts, scratched paint. The defects were small, but widespread enough to become a problem. By 1972, the conflict exploded into a strike. The Lordstown strike of 1972 became national news, not because of its size, though thousands of workers walked out, but because of what it represented. This was not a traditional strike over wages. It was about working conditions, about the pace of work, about whether automation and efficiency had gone too far. It was young workers, many with long hair and countercultural attitudes, refusing to be treated as extensions of the machinery. The strike lasted 3 weeks. GM eventually agreed to slow the line slightly and address some grievances, but the underlying tension never fully resolved. Lordstown had become a symbol of a new kind of labor conflict. Not management versus unions fighting over money, but workers versus a system that seemed to value speed and cost-cutting over human dignity. Still, for all the conflict, the plant provided something undeniable: jobs. Thousands of them. Jobs that paid $20 to $30 per hour by the 1980s, equivalent to $60,000 to $80,000 annual salaries in today's dollars when benefits were included. Jobs that required only a high school diploma, but provided middle-class stability. Jobs that let workers buy homes, raise families, send kids to college, retire with pensions. Lordstown Assembly became the economic engine of Trumbull County. Workers spent their wages locally. Restaurants, car dealerships, grocery stores, schools, all benefited. The tax base expanded. Public services improved. For 2 decades, from the late 1960s to the mid-1980s, Lordstown seemed to prove that industrial jobs could sustain not just individuals, but entire communities. Yet even then, warning signs appeared. The Vega, despite high production numbers, had quality problems that damaged GM's reputation. By the late 1970s, Japanese automakers, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, were producing cars that were more reliable, more fuel efficient, and increasingly competitive on price. American manufacturers, including GM, were slow to adapt. The plant retooled several times, producing different models as GM tried to respond to changing markets. The Chevrolet Cavalier, the Cobalt, the Cruze. Each new model brought hope that this would be the car that secured Lordstown's future. Each time, the hope lasted a few years before market shifts, quality issues, or corporate decisions led to the next round of uncertainty. The workers, union leadership, and local officials all understood the basic equation. Lordstown survived as long as GM chose to keep it open. The company could move production elsewhere. It could close the plant. It could automate further, reducing the workforce even while keeping the facility running. Power rested entirely with corporate executives in Detroit, making decisions based on quarterly earnings reports and shareholder expectations, not on the lives of workers in northeastern Ohio. That imbalance of power would shape everything that followed. The plant stood on its acres of Ohio land, productive and profitable, but vulnerable, always vulnerable, waiting for decisions made in boardrooms far away by people who had never walked the assembly line, never lived in the valley, never depended on those paychecks to survive. Part 2. The line speeds up the crack show. The assembly line at Lordstown was, in its time, an engineering marvel, a carefully orchestrated sequence of human labor and mechanical precision that transformed raw components into finished automobiles at a pace that seemed almost impossible. Every 36 seconds, another car, hour after hour, shift after shift, year after year. To understand what happened to Lordstown, you have to understand what it meant to work that line, not from a distance, not through statistics, but through the physical and mental reality of standing in one spot, performing the same motions hundreds of times per shift, knowing that any mistake will be visible to supervisors, co-workers, and eventually customers. Workers arrived before their shift started, punched in, put on safety equipment, and walked to their stations. The line was already moving. It almost never stopped except for breaks and shift changes. You stepped into flow and started working immediately. Install a door panel. Tighten 4 bolts. Connect a wire harness. Check alignment. Move to the next vehicle. Repeat, repeat, repeat. The speed was relentless. In the early years, the line moved at 60 units per hour. Later, management pushed for a faster production. 70, 80, even 100 cars per hour during peak periods. That meant less time per task, less margin for error, less opportunity to fix mistakes or adjust if something went wrong. The physical toll accumulated. Repetitive motion injuries, carpal tunnel, tendinitis, back problems were common, standing for 8 or 10 or 12 hours, often in awkward positions, wore bodies down. Noise from machinery was constant and damaging to hearing despite ear protection. The air smelled of metal, paint, welding fumes, and industrial solvents. Summer heat inside the plant was brutal. Air conditioning was minimal or non-existent in many areas. The mental toll was harder to measure, but no less real. The monotony of the same task, thousands of times, could be soul-crushing. The pressure to keep pace, to not be the worker who slowed the line or caused a defect, created constant stress. Supervisors watched for anyone falling behind, anyone making mistakes, anyone showing signs of the defiance or sabotage that had marked the early 1970s. Yet for all the difficulty, the work provided something increasingly rare in America: economic security. The pay was good. The benefits were solid: health insurance, dental, pensions managed by the UAW that promised a decent retirement. Workers had planned their lives around these jobs. Buy a house, get married, have kids. The work was hard, but it was reliable, or at least it seemed to be. Through the 1980s, That reliability began to erode. GM faced increasing pressure from Japanese automakers, whose vehicles were widely perceived as higher quality and more fuel efficient. American consumers, burned by recalls and quality problems with domestic cars, started buying imports in larger numbers. GM's market share declined from over 50% in the 1960s to under 40% by the mid-1980s. The company's response involved layoffs, plant closures, and a push for concessions from the UAW. Nationally, GM cut tens of thousands of jobs. Dozens of plants closed entirely. Lordstown survived, but not unchanged. Employment at the plant, which had peaked above 10,000 workers in the early 1970s, fell to around 8,000 by the mid-1980s, then to 6,000 by the 1990s. Each round of layoffs followed a similar pattern. GM would announce production cuts, citing weak sales or the need to reduce inventory. Workers would be laid off, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently. The union would negotiate, trying to minimize job losses or secure buyout packages for older workers. Local politicians would issue statements expressing concern and promising to fight for the plant. Then the layoffs would happen anyway. The workers who remained dealt with survivors' guilt and increased pressure. Fewer people on the line meant everyone's job was more critical. Automation increased. Robots handled more welding and painting, tasks that had once been done by hand. The jobs that remained were often more technical, requiring skills some older workers struggled to learn. The community felt every shift. When Lordstown laid off 1,000 workers, that meant 1,000 families with less income, mortgages at risk, car payments missed, kids unable to afford college. Local businesses suffered as spending declined. Tax revenues fell, forcing cuts to schools and public services. The ripple effect spread across the valley. Yet through all this, a strange optimism persisted. Each new vehicle model brought renewed hope. When GM announced that Lordstown would build the Cavalier in the 1980s, then the Cobalt in 2004, then the Cruze in 2008, workers and local leaders treated it as proof the plan had a future. Millions were invested in retooling, new equipment installed, workers retrained. Production ramped up. For a time, things would stabilize. Employment would tick back up. The line would run smoothly. Orders would come in. Then, inevitably, sales would soften. Competition would intensify. Corporate priorities would shift. And the cycle of layoffs and uncertainty would begin again. The union remained a powerful presence, though its influence was waning. The UAW had won major victories in previous decades. Higher wages, better benefits, strict work rules that protected jobs and limited management ability to speed up the line or change assignments arbitrarily. But by the 1990s and 2000s, the union was increasingly on the defensive, fighting to preserve gains rather than win new ones. Contracts became exercises in damage control. The union agreed to two-tier wage systems where new hires earned significantly less than veteran workers for the same jobs. It accepted cuts to retiree benefits. It allowed more automation and more flexible work rules. These concessions were framed as necessary to keep the plant competitive, to save jobs in the long run. But they also signaled a fundamental shift in power. Management dictated terms. The union responded. Workers adapted or left. Behind the scenes, more troubling patterns emerged. GM was investing heavily in plants outside the United States, Mexico, China, other countries where labor was cheaper and regulations looser. The company was also developing a business strategy increasingly focused on trucks and SUVs, which were more profitable than the small cars Lordstown produced. The Cruze, for all its initial success, never generated the margins GM wanted. Workers at Lordstown were not blind to these realities. They read the news. They saw the writing on the wall. But what were the alternatives? Most had spent their entire careers at the plant. Their skills were specific to automotive assembly. Their roots were in the valley. Their homes, their families, their lives were built around Lordstown. Leaving meant starting over, often in middle age, with few prospects for comparable pay. So they stayed. They kept working. They hoped each new contract, each new model, each promise from management would be the one that stabilized their futures. They hoped because the alternative, accepting that their jobs, their community, their way of life might simply disappear, was too painful to face directly. The machinery kept running. The line kept moving. Cars rolled off the assembly floor, were driven onto transport trucks, and shipped to dealerships across the country. From a distance, Lordstown looked like it was working, productive, profitable, even, but up close, the cracks were visible. The workforce kept shrinking. The parking lots grew emptier. Local businesses closed. Younger workers left the valley entirely, seeking opportunities elsewhere. The population aged. The region's economic base narrowed further as other industries, steel, rubber, small manufacturing, continued their own long declines. Lordstown Assembly was not just a factory. It was a test case for a question facing industrial America. Could traditional manufacturing survive globalization, automation, and corporate decision-making driven primarily by shareholder value? Could communities that depended on these plants adapt, diversify, or were they destined to fade as the factories closed? The answer was taking shape, though few wanted to name it aloud. The plant stood on its Ohio land, still producing, still employing thousands, but increasingly fragile. Every quarterly earnings call, every shift in consumer demand, every decision made in GM's Detroit headquarters could be the one that finally ended it. The workers knew it. The union knew it. The local officials knew it. And yet, the work continued, because what else could they do? The line ran. The cars emerged. The paychecks came. And everyone pretended, for as long as they could, that this might somehow last forever. Part 3. The recession, the bailout, and the bill that came due. The global financial crisis of 2008 hit the American auto industry like a freight train. Sales collapsed. Credit markets froze. GM, once the world's largest automaker, teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. The entire structure of American manufacturing, already weakened by decades of foreign competition, rising labor costs, and strategic missteps, suddenly faced existential threat. Lordstown Assembly, like every GM facility, found itself at the mercy of forces far beyond its control. The plant had no say in GM's financial decisions, no influence over the credit markets, no ability to change consumer behavior. Workers showed up to their shifts and waited to hear whether they would still have jobs the next week, the next month, the next year. In late 2008 and early 2009, GM and Chrysler requested federal bailouts. The automakers argued that failure would trigger catastrophic job losses, not just at the car companies themselves, but throughout the supply chain and in communities dependent on auto manufacturing. The alternative, they said, was economic collapse across the industrial Midwest. Congress and the Obama administration agreed, though the bailout was deeply controversial. In exchange for roughly $50 billion in federal loans, GM entered managed bankruptcy, restructured its operations, closed plants, cut jobs, and renegotiated contracts with the UAW. The government effectively took ownership of GM, becoming the largest shareholder. Lordstown survived the initial cuts. The plant was producing the Chevy Cobalt, and GM decided to keep it running, at least for the moment. But employment fell sharply. By 2009, Lordstown had fewer than 3,000 workers, down from over 6,000 just a few years earlier. Entire shifts disappeared. The parking lots, once full, became expanses of empty pavement. The community absorbed the shock as best it could. Unemployment spiked. Foreclosures increased. Local government revenues declined, forcing cuts to services. Schools lost funding. The social fabric frayed under economic stress. Divorce rates rose, addiction rates increased, and the sense of stability that had defined the region for decades eroded. In 2011, GM announced that Lordstown would retool to produce the Chevrolet Cruze, a compact car positioned as a global product that would compete directly with imports. The company invested roughly $350 million in the plant, updating equipment and training workers. The Cruze was supposed to be Lordstown's salvation, a modern, fuel-efficient car that American consumers would embrace. For a few years, it worked. The Cruze sold well, particularly in its first years. Employment at Lordstown climbed back above 4,000. The line ran 3 shifts again. Workers who had been laid off returned. The mood while cautious, improved. Maybe the plan had turned a corner. Maybe it would survive after all. But the recovery was fragile. American consumers, particularly after gas prices declined in the mid-2010s, returned to buying trucks and SUVs. Small cars, no matter how good, struggled to compete. The Cruise's sales declined year over year. GM's profits increasingly came from pickups and large SUVs, not from compact cars like the Cruise. Complicating matters further, GM had opened plants in Mexico where labor costs were a fraction of what they were in Ohio. The company could produce similar vehicles there far more cheaply. From a purely financial standpoint, Lordstown was increasingly hard to justify. Why pay American wages when Mexican workers would do the same job for less? The union fought back, negotiating contract provisions intended to protect Lordstown, but the leverage was limited. GM could idle the plant. It could move production. It could simply decide that Lordstown no longer fit its business strategy. The UAW could negotiate, but it could not force GM to keep the factory open. Workers felt the shift. The promises that had sustained them, work hard, stay loyal, and the company will take care of you, no longer seemed reliable. GM was not the paternalistic corporation of the mid-20th century. It was a global business focused on quarterly earnings and shareholder returns. Workers were costs to be managed, not partners in a shared enterprise. Local politicians tried to help. Ohio senators and representatives, both Democrats and Republicans, lobbied GM to keep Lordstown open. The state offered tax incentives. Local officials touted the skilled workforce and the plant's productivity. But these efforts ran into cold economic logic. If GM could make more money producing vehicles elsewhere, why would it choose Lordstown? The question was never asked aloud in quite those terms, but it hung over every discussion. The market in this story was an impersonal force, a system of incentives and pressures that dictated outcomes regardless of human cost. GM executives were not villains deliberately destroying communities. They were managers responding to competitive pressures, shareholder expectations, and global market conditions. That their decisions devastated thousands of lives was, from their perspective, unfortunate but unavoidable. By 2016 and 2017, the signs were unmistakable. GM cut one shift at Lordstown, then hinted that further cuts might be necessary. Employment fell below 3,000 again. Rumors circulated that the plant was on borrowed time. Workers watched the news anxiously, looking for any hint of what might come next. Then came the 2016 presidential election. Donald Trump, campaigning in Ohio, promised to bring manufacturing jobs back. He visited Youngstown and told crowds that plants like Lordstown would not close on his watch. He blamed trade deals, NAFTA, agreements with China, for shipping American jobs overseas and vowed to renegotiate or abandon them. Trump won Ohio decisively, carrying Trumbull County and the broader Mahoning Valley, areas that had voted Democratic for decades. Workers at Lordstown, desperate for any hope, supported him in significant numbers. They believed, or wanted to believe, that someone in power finally cared about their jobs, their communities, their futures. The hope lasted less than 2 years. In November 2018, GM announced a massive restructuring. The company would cease production at several North American plants, including Lordstown. The Cruise would be discontinued. By March 2019, the plant would close. The announcement devastated the community. Workers, many of whom had believed Trump's promises, felt betrayed. Local officials scrambled to find solutions. The union protested, staging rallies and calling for boycotts of GM vehicles. Trump himself, in a speech a few months earlier, had told workers don't move, don't sell your house. Now, the plant was closing anyway. GM's justification was straightforward. Consumer demand had shifted away from small cars. The Cruise was not profitable. The company needed to focus resources on trucks, SUVs, and eventually electric vehicles. Keeping Lordstown open did not make business sense. The closure happened in stages. First, the third shift ended. Then the second. By March 2019, the final Cruise rolled off the line. Workers gathered for photographs, many in tears, marking the end of an era. The plant that had once employed over 10,000 now employed none. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Lordstown's workers, even those who transferred to other GM facilities, left holes in the community. Suppliers who depended on the plant faced their own layoffs or closures. Local businesses lost customers. Tax revenues collapsed. The region, already struggling, faced a new crisis. But the story did not end there. The plant itself, the physical structure, remained. Over 6 million square feet of industrial space, equipped with assembly lines and manufacturing tools, sitting empty. GM owned it, but no longer needed it. The question became, what comes next? Part 4. The saviors arrive with electric dreams. Empty factories attract opportunists. Some see potential. Others see a chance to profit from desperation. In Lordstown's case, both arrived at once, packaged as the future of American manufacturing. In 2019, shortly after GM closed the plant, a startup called Lordstown Motors Corporation emerged. The company, backed by a group of investors with limited automotive experience, promised to transform the shuttered factory into a facility producing electric pickup trucks. They would buy the plant from GM, hire back workers, and position Lordstown at the forefront of the electric vehicle revolution. The pitch was compelling. Electric vehicles were the future. Tesla had proven there was a market. Traditional automakers were investing billions in EV development. Lordstown Motors would build the Endurance, an electric pickup designed for fleet customers, utility companies, municipalities, businesses that needed durable work trucks. The company claimed pre-orders justified production. They promised to hire 1,500 workers initially, with potential for more. Local leaders embraced the plan. Ohio's government provided incentives, loans, tax breaks, infrastructure improvements. The state was desperate to show it could retain and attract manufacturing jobs. Lordstown Motors became a symbol of resilience, proof that the region could adapt to changing industries. Workers were more cautious. Many had heard promises before. They had seen politicians cut ribbons and make speeches, only to watch jobs disappear years later. But they also needed hope. The alternative, accepting that Lordstown was finished, was too grim. So they attended town halls, asked questions, and tried to believe this might work. Lordstown Motors officially purchased a plant from GM in November 2019 for $20 million, a fraction of its original value. The company spent the next year preparing for production, retrofitting equipment, hiring engineers, and attempting to raise capital through public markets. In 2020, Lordstown Motors went public via a SPAC, Special Purpose Acquisition Company, a financial mechanism that allowed it to bypass traditional IPO scrutiny. The company raised hundreds of millions of dollars. Its stock price surged. Executives gave interviews promising imminent production. The Endurance was coming, they said. Jobs were coming. Lordstown would rise again. But behind the public optimism, problems accumulated. The company was burning through cash at an alarming rate. Production delays were constant. The Endurance, in testing, showed reliability issues. Claims about pre-orders turned out to be exaggerated. Many were non-binding expressions of interest, not firm commitments. By mid-2021, the truth became unavoidable. Lordstown Motors was in financial trouble. The company admitted it lacked the funding to reach mass production. Its CEO and CFO resigned amid scrutiny over misleading statements to investors. The stock price collapsed. Workers who had hoped for recalls to the plant realized they had been sold another fantasy. The company limped along for another year, producing a handful of prototype vehicles but never achieving commercial production. In 2023, Lordstown Motors filed for bankruptcy. The plant once again sat empty. The failure was predictable to anyone watching closely. Lordstown Motors had no proven track record. Its management lacked automotive manufacturing experience. Building vehicles, especially electric vehicles with complex battery systems, required expertise, capital, and supply chains the startup never secured. The company had sold a story, an appealing story about American revival and electric futures, but had no realistic path to delivering it. Yet politicians, investors, and some community members chose to believe because the alternative was accepting that Lordstown might never come back. The startup preyed on that desperation. using it to raise money, generate publicity, and enrich early investors even as the actual business collapsed. The workers, the community, and the state of Ohio were left with debt, broken promises, and a still empty factory. The loans Ohio had extended to Lordstown Motors would likely never be repaid. The jobs never materialized. The vision of Lordstown leading an electric vehicle revolution vanished like morning fog. Then, in a twist, another company stepped in. Foxconn, the Taiwanese electronics manufacturer best known for assembling iPhones, announced in 2023 that it would purchase the plant and use it to build electric vehicles in partnership with Fisker, another EV startup. The deal involved more government incentives, more promises about jobs, more speeches about Lordstown's comeback. Workers and local residents greeted the news with exhausted skepticism. How many times could they be told the same story? How many saviors would arrive, make promises, take incentives, and then fade away? The pattern was becoming grimly familiar. As of late 2023 and into 2024, Foxconn's plans remained vague. Production had not begun. Hiring had not ramped up. The plant sat largely unused. Fisker, the partner company, itself faced financial difficulties and questions about its viability. The promised jobs remained hypothetical. Meanwhile, the community continued to bleed. Young people left for opportunities elsewhere. Older workers who had taken buyouts or early retirement struggled on fixed incomes. Local governments, starved of tax revenue, cut services. Schools consolidated. Infrastructure decayed. The Mahoning Valley, once an industrial powerhouse, increasingly resembled a region in managed decline. The empty plant became a symbol of failed promises and misplaced faith in market-driven solutions. Every politician who visited talked about public-private partnerships, innovation ecosystems, and workforce development. But none of that translated into stable, well-paying jobs for the people who needed them. The workers who had built careers at Lordstown Assembly, who had believed their labor had value, who had trusted that loyalty and hard work would be rewarded, were left to navigate a landscape that no longer had a place for them. Some found work at other GM facilities, accepting transfers that meant leaving families and communities behind. Others took lower-paying jobs in warehouses, retail, or service industries. Many simply left the workforce entirely, retiring early or disappearing into statistics about long-term unemployment. The psychological toll was immense. These were people whose identity had been tied to their work, to making things, to being part of something larger than themselves. The factory's closure didn't just take their jobs. It took their sense of purpose, their connection to tradition of industrial labor that stretched back generations. The plant stood on its land, a monument to what had been and what might have been. Its steel frame remained solid. Its assembly lines, though idle, were still capable of producing vehicles. But without people working them, without a company willing to invest in making them run, they were just machinery, expensive, sophisticated, and utterly useless. Part 5. The Workers Who Remain and the Ghosts They Carry. The story of Lordstown is often told through statistics. Jobs lost, production ended, companies failed. But statistics flatten human experience. They turn lives into numbers, suffering into data points. To understand what Lordstown's closure really meant, you have to listen to the people who lived through it. Mike, a 52-year-old who spent 28 years on the assembly line, described the final day in March 2019 as surreal. We knew it was coming, but when it actually happened, when that last car rolled off the line, it still felt impossible. Like, this can't be real. This factory was my entire adult life. I bought my house because of this job, put 2 kids through college, had a pension coming, and then it was just gone. Mike transferred to a GM plant in Tennessee. The pay was comparable, but he left behind his wife, who had her own job she couldn't abandon, and elderly parents he helped care for. He lived in a small apartment near the new plant, drove home every other weekend, and counted the years until he could retire. "I'm one of the lucky ones," he said. "I still have a GM job, but I lost my life, my community, everything that mattered except the paycheck." Sarah worked in the plant's quality control department. She was 45 when Lordstown closed, with a teenage daughter and a son in middle school. Unlike Mike, She didn't transfer. The other GM facilities were too far away, and uprooting her family seemed impossible. She took a job at a local warehouse, earning $15 per hour versus the $28 she had made at GM. The math doesn't work, she said. My mortgage is the same. My bills are the same, but my income is half what it was. I'm one unexpected expense away from losing everything. Sarah's story was common. Workers who stayed in the valley faced a job market that offered nothing comparable to what they had lost. Warehouses, retail, service jobs. These paid far less, offered fewer benefits, and provided little security. The middle-class life that Lordstown had made possible simply evaporated. For older workers, the situation was particularly cruel. Jim, 59 when the plant closed, had hoped to work another 6 years before retiring with a full pension. Instead, he was forced into early retirement. His pension was reduced. His health insurance, once covered by GM until Medicare kicked in at 65, became a monthly expense he struggled to afford. I worked my whole life, he said, 40 years, and this is what I get. Scrambling to pay for insurance, worrying about money, feeling thrown away. The psychological damage extended beyond individuals to families and the community as a whole. Marriages strained under financial pressure. Younger workers who had hoped to build careers like their parents or grandparents realized those opportunities no longer existed. The suicide rate in Trumbull County increased. Opioid addiction, already a problem in the region, worsened as despair deepened. Local businesses felt the losses in waves. Bob owned a diner near the plant that had served workers for 30 years. Breakfast before shift, lunch during breaks, dinner after hours. When Lordstown closed, his customer base disappeared. I try to hang on, he said, but when your main customers are gone, what are you supposed to do? I closed in 2020. 40 years, my whole life in that place, and I had to walk away. The same pattern repeated across the valley. Auto parts suppliers, gas stations, grocery stores, bars, clothing shops, all dependent on wages and plant, struggled or closed. The economic ecosystem that Lordstown had sustained collapsed piece by piece. Schools faced budget crises as property values declined and tax revenues fell. Teachers were laid off, programs cut, buildings that had once been maintained fell into disrepair. Parents who wanted better opportunities for their children increasingly moved away, further eroding the population and the tax base. Yet amid the loss, something unexpected emerged. Anger, but also solidarity. Workers who had been atomized on the assembly line, competing for overtime or promotions, came together in shared grievance. They organized protests, not just against GM, but against a system that had allowed their community to be discarded. They demanded that politicians stop offering empty promises and start fighting for policies that protected workers, not just corporations. Some workers became activists, joining national movements for labor rights, for trade policy reform, for a Green New Deal that would create manufacturing jobs in renewable energy. They testified before Congress, gave interviews, and told their stories to anyone who would listen. They refused to be invisible. Others turned inward, focusing on survival and family. They worked multiple jobs, stretched every dollar, and tried to maintain normalcy for their kids. They avoided the news because it was too painful. They stopped believing in politicians, corporations, or any institution that promised help. The divide between those who still believed change was possible and those who had given up entirely ran through the community like a fault line. Town meetings became contentious. Some wanted to fight for Lordstown's revival. Others argued the fight was over and resources should go toward helping people leave or retrain. There was no consensus, only pain and competing visions of how to respond to it. The empty plant loomed over all of it, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Some former workers couldn't drive past it. The sight was too painful. Others visited regularly, standing at the fence, looking at the building where they had spent decades. It's like visiting a grave, one said, but I can't stay away. The grief was real and it was complicated. People mourned not just jobs, but identity, community, and the belief that hard work mattered. They mourned a version of America where industrial labor was valued, where ordinary people could earn decent livings, where loyalty was reciprocated. That America, if it had ever truly existed, was gone. Yet even in grief, there was resilience. Communities did not simply collapse. People adapted. They found new ways to support each other. Churches and community organizations provided food, counseling, and connection. Neighbors helped neighbors. The bonds forged through shared hardship became, for some, a source of strength. But resilience should not be romanticized. It is not a substitute for justice or economic security. Praising workers for adapting to poverty does not address the systems that created that poverty. Celebrating community solidarity does not bring back lost jobs or rebuild devastated regions. The people of Lordstown and the broader Mahoning Valley deserve better than platitudes about resilience. They deserve policies that protected their jobs before they vanished. They deserved a government that prioritized workers over corporate profits. They deserved a society that valued the labor that built the country and the people who performed it. What they got instead was abandonment dressed up as economic inevitability. They got politicians who offered sympathy but no solutions. They got a system that treated them as expendable, their communities as acceptable collateral damage in a pursuit of efficiency and shareholder returns. The workers carried that knowledge with them, along with the memories of the plant, the friends they made on the line, the pride they once felt in their work. They carried it as a weight, a wound that never quite healed. And they asked, over and over, a question no one seemed able to answer. Why did it have to be this way? Part 6. The Politician's Theater and the Cameras that left. Politicians love factories, not the messy reality of industrial labor, but the symbolic potential. A factory represents jobs, American manufacturing, working-class voters. It is a stage where speeches about economic renewal sound authentic, where promises can be made without immediate accountability. Lordstown became a magnet for this kind of political theater. From its opening in the 1960s through its closure in 2019, and the failed revivals that followed, politicians of both parties visited, posed for photographs, and made promises. Few delivered. In 2017, Donald Trump visited Youngstown, just miles from Lordstown. He spoke to a crowd of thousands, many of them auto workers. "We're going to fill up those factories," he said. "They're going to be filled up. Don't move. Don't sell your house." The crowd cheered. Workers wanted to believe him. He seemed different, unscripted, willing to challenge the establishment that had abandoned them. Trump blamed trade deals, particularly NAFTA, for shipping jobs to Mexico. He promised to renegotiate or withdraw from agreements that hurt American workers. He threatened tariffs on imported vehicles. He positioned himself as the champion of forgotten communities like Lordstown. Then, barely a year later, GM announced Lordstown would close. Trump's response was to publicly criticize GM and its CEO, Mary Barra. He tweeted his displeasure. He told reporters he was not happy with the decision, but he took no concrete action to stop it. No tariffs were imposed. No penalties were levied. GM closed the plant anyway. Workers felt betrayed. Many had voted for Trump precisely because he promised to save their jobs. His failure to deliver was not just political disappointment. It was personal. He had told them not to sell their houses. They had believed him. Now their houses were worth less. Their jobs were gone, and Trump had moved on to other issues. Democrats were no better. Barack Obama, during his presidency, visited the region and praised the auto bailout for saving jobs. He was technically correct. The bailout prevented GM from collapsing entirely, but it also led to plant closures, job cuts, and the very conditions that made Lordstown vulnerable. The bailout saved the company, not the community. Local politicians, county commissioners, mayors, state legislators, tried to help but lacked real power. They could offer small tax incentives or lobby GM and potential buyers. But major decisions were made by corporate executives in Detroit, by shareholders on Wall Street, by federal policymakers in Washington. Local officials were reduced to spectators, managing decline rather than preventing it. Ohio senators and representatives made regular pilgrimages to Lordstown during the crisis years. They held town halls, issued press releases, and demanded answers from GM. Sherrod Brown, Ohio's Democratic senator, was particularly vocal. pushing for legislation to penalize companies that close plants after receiving federal bailout funds. Rob Portman, the Republican senator at the time, focused on trade policy and retraining programs. None of it made a difference. GM's decision was final. The plant closed. The promised Lordstown Motors revival failed. Foxconn's plans remained vague. The politicians' efforts, whether sincere or performative, produced no meaningful results. The media followed the politicians. When Trump visited, cameras arrived. When the closure was announced, reporters descended on the valley, interviewing workers, filming the empty parking lots, crafting stories about American decline. The coverage was often sympathetic, sometimes insightful, but it was also transient. Once the immediate crisis passed, the cameras left. Lordstown disappeared from national headlines. The workers' ongoing struggles, the foreclosures, the job searches, the psychological toll, were no longer newsworthy. The story had been told. America moved on to the next tragedy, the next scandal, the next political fight. This cycle of attention and abandonment was its own form of cruelty. Communities in crisis briefly became visible, their pain acknowledged, their stories told. Then the attention evaporated, leaving them to cope in obscurity. The problems did not go away when the cameras left. They intensified. But without media coverage, without political pressure, there was little incentive for anyone in power to address them. Workers learned not to trust the attention. They gave interviews because they hoped someone, somewhere might care enough to do something. But they also knew the pattern. The reporters would leave. The politicians would stop calling. The promises would be forgotten. And they would still be there, living in a community that had been hollowed out, trying to survive in an economy that had no place for them. Some workers became cynical, refusing to engage with politicians or media. Others remained hopeful, believing that if they just told their story one more time, to one more reporter, one more elected official, something might change. Both responses were understandable. Both were heartbreaking. The political theater around Lordstown revealed deeper truths about power in America. Politicians could visit, make speeches, and express sympathy, but they could not or would not challenge the systems that allow corporations to abandon communities at will. They could not override the logic of global capitalism that prioritized profit over people. They could not force GM to keep the plant open or compel startups to deliver on their promises. The workers needed political power, not political sympathy. They needed policies that gave them leverage, stronger unions, trade rules that protected domestic manufacturing, consequences for corporations that broke communities, investment in industrial policy that prioritized employment over quarterly earnings. Instead, they got speeches, photo ops, and occasional symbolic gesture. They got politicians who acknowledged their pain but offered no structural solutions. They got a system that treated their suffering as inevitable, a regrettable but unavoidable consequence of economic progress. The factory sat empty while the politicians moved on. The workers stayed behind, living with the consequences of decisions they had no power to influence. And the cycle continued, waiting for the next factory closure, the next politician making promises, the next wave of cameras that would arrive, tell the story, and leave. Part 7. What automation took and what it could not replace. The story of Lordstown is often framed as a battle between American workers and foreign competition. But that narrative, while partially true, obscures a more fundamental force: automation. Robots did not close Lordstown, but they transformed what it meant to work there and made human labor increasingly optional in GM's calculations. When the plant opened in 1966, almost everything was done by hand. Workers welded, painted, assembled, and inspected. The assembly line coordinated human labor, but humans performed the tasks. By the 1980s, that had begun to change. Welding robots appeared first, handling repetitive tasks faster and more consistently than humans. Paint robots followed, applying coatings with precision that reduced waste and improved quality. At first, automation seemed like a partnership. Robots handled dangerous or monotonous jobs. Humans did work requiring judgment, dexterity, and adaptation. Employment at Lordstown remained high through the 1980s because demand was strong enough to absorb both human and machine labor. But the balance shifted. As robots became more sophisticated and less expensive, GM increasingly chose them over workers. A robot did not require wages, benefits, or breaks. It did not file grievances, join unions, or slow down in protest. It could work 24 hours a day without fatigue. From a corporate perspective, automation was not just an efficiency improvement. It was a solution to the problem of labor. By the 2000s, Lordstown's assembly line was heavily automated. Robots performed most welding and painting. Automated guided vehicles moved parts between stations. Computer systems track quality and inventory in real time. The jobs that remained for humans were often either highly skilled, programming and maintaining robots, or low-skilled tasks that were not yet cost-effective to automate. This created a divide within the workforce. Skilled technicians who could work with automated systems were valuable and relatively secure. Traditional assembly line workers, whose jobs involved repetitive manual tasks, were increasingly vulnerable. The plant needed fewer of them, and those who remained faced constant pressure as management looked for ways to automate their roles entirely. Automation also changed the nature of labor disputes. When workers in the 1970s slowed the line or called strikes, they could halt production. That gave them leverage. By the 2010s, automation reduced that leverage. A plant with extensive robotics could keep running with a skeleton crew. Strikes disrupted production but did not stop it entirely. The balance of power shifted decisively toward management. Workers understood what was happening. They saw robots replacing colleagues. They attended training sessions where they learned to operate or maintain machines that were, in a very real sense, taking their jobs. The union negotiated provisions requiring GM to retrain displaced workers. But retraining for what? If the jobs were disappearing across the industry, where would those workers go? The psychological impact was significant. For generations, industrial workers had believed their labor had inherent value. They made things. They contributed to the economy. They earned their place in society through work. Automation challenged that belief. If a robot could do your job better, faster, and cheaper, what did that say about your value? Some workers adapted, embracing new skills and roles. Others struggled with the sense that they were becoming obsolete, that the world no longer needed what they had to offer. That feeling of disposability, of being replaceable by machines, was corrosive to dignity and self-worth. Yet automation, for all its efficiency, could not replace certain human capabilities. Judgment, problem-solving, adaptability. These remained difficult to fully automate. When something went wrong on the line, when a part did not fit correctly or a process needed adjustment, human workers diagnosed and fixed it. Robots followed programs. Humans improvised. GM's mistake, and the mistake of American manufacturing more broadly, was treating automation as a substitute for labor rather than a complement to it. A factory with both highly skilled workers and advanced automation could be incredibly productive, but that required investing in workforce development, maintaining good labor relations, and treating workers as assets rather than costs. Instead, GM used automation primarily to reduce labor costs. The company did not train workers extensively to work alongside new technology. It did not share productivity gains with the workforce. It used automation to minimize its dependence on human labor, creating a downward spiral. Fewer jobs led to weaker unions, which led to more automation, which led to even fewer jobs. By the time Lordstown closed, the plant was producing vehicles with far fewer workers than it had required decades earlier. The work that remained was often temporary or contracted, lacking security and benefits that had defined auto industry jobs in the past. The promise of automation, that it would free humans from drudgery and create better, safer jobs, had not materialized for most workers. Instead, it had undermined their bargaining power and made them expendable. This pattern extended beyond Lordstown. Across American manufacturing, automation was displacing workers faster than new jobs were being created. The jobs that remained often paid less and offered fewer benefits. The middle-class pathway that industrial work had once provided was narrowing, leaving fewer opportunities for people without advanced degrees or specialized training. The question facing communities like Lordstown was not whether automation would continue. It would, but whether society would ensure that the gains from automation were shared broadly or concentrated among shareholders and executives? Would displaced workers receive support, retraining, and new opportunities? Or would they be left to fend for themselves in an economy that no longer valued their labor? So far, the answer had been abandonment. Workers were told to retrain, to move, to adapt. But retraining for what? Moving where? Adapting how? The economy that existed offered them few good options. The policies needed to create those options, massive investment in education, infrastructure, and new industries, were not forthcoming. Lordstown's closure was not just about GM choosing to stop making the cruise. It was about an economic system that prioritized short-term profits and efficiency over long-term community stability and worker welfare. Automation was a tool in that system. It could have been deployed differently, in ways that maintained employment while improving productivity. But that would have required choices GM and other corporations were unwilling to make. The empty plant stood as a monument to those choices. The robots inside, idle now, were capable of extraordinary productivity. But without workers to maintain them, without a community to support them, without a company willing to invest in them, they were just expensive metal and circuitry. Technology alone could not sustain a factory or a community. That required human commitment, and that commitment had been withdrawn. Part 8. The environmental cost hiding in plain sight. Lordstown's story is usually told through jobs and economics. But there's another dimension, quieter and often ignored, the environmental legacy of decades of industrial production. Factories do not just employ people and make products. They consume resources, generate waste, and leave marks on the land that persist long after the last worker clocks out. The Mahoning River runs through the valley, winding past Youngstown, Warren, and the site of Lordstown Assembly. For over a century, that river absorbed the byproducts of industrial activity. Steel mills discharged heated water and chemical waste. Auto plants released solvents, paint residue, and metal particles. The cumulative effect degraded water quality, harmed aquatic life, and created contamination that would take generations to remediate. Lordstown Assembly itself used vast quantities of water, chemicals, and energy. Painting vehicles required volatile organic compounds, VOCs, substances that contributed to air pollution and posed health risks. Metal stamping and welding generated particulate matter. Waste disposal, even when managed according to regulations, created hazards that lingered. In the 1970s and 1980s, before environmental regulations tightened, disposal practices were often crude. Hazardous materials were stored inadequately, sometimes leaked into soil and groundwater. Cleanup efforts began in later decades, but the damage was done. Parts of the valley remained contaminated, with restrictions on groundwater use and ongoing monitoring required. Workers at the plant were exposed to these hazards daily. Ventilation in some areas was poor. Protective equipment was not always adequate. Exposure to solvents, paint fumes, and metal dust contributed to health problems, respiratory issues, skin conditions, and in some cases, cancers that took years to develop and were difficult to link definitively to workplace exposure. The union fought for better safety standards, winning improvements over time, but the tension between production speed and worker safety never fully resolved. Meeting quotas often meant cutting corners. Supervisors prioritized output. Workers who complained too loudly about conditions faced retaliation or marginalization. Beyond the plant itself, the environmental costs radiated outward. The electricity powering Lordstown came largely from coal plants, contributing to air pollution and climate change. The vehicles produced at the plant, while providing transportation, also generated emissions over their lifetimes. The entire system, extraction of raw materials, manufacturing, use, and disposal, carried environmental costs that were never fully accounted for in the price of a car. When Lordstown closed, the environmental issues did not disappear. The building remained, filled with residual chemicals, old equipment, and materials that required careful handling. Remediation was necessary, but who would pay for it? GM had liability, but the company minimized costs wherever possible. State and federal funds were limited. The community, already financially strained, could not afford a full cleanup. The site became a kind of environmental limbo, not actively dangerous enough to demand immediate action, but not clean enough to safely repurpose without significant investment. Potential buyers, including Lordstown Motors and Foxconn, inherited these issues. The cost of environmental compliance added to the financial burden of restarting production, making the plant even less attractive. This pattern repeated across the Rust Belt. Closed factories left behind contaminated sites, known as brownfields. These properties sat unused because the cost to clean up outweighed potential benefits. Communities desperate for economic revival could not afford to remediate them. Private developers avoided them unless governments offered substantial incentives. The environmental legacy of industrial decline became another weight communities like Lordstown had to carry. They had sacrificed their air and water quality for economic prosperity. When the prosperity ended, the pollution remained. Climate change added another layer. As awareness of carbon emissions grew, the automotive industry faced pressure to transition to electric vehicles. GM's decision to close Lordstown and focus on EVs elsewhere reflected that shift. But the transition itself posed questions. Would new EV plants be built in places like Ohio, providing jobs to displaced workers? Or would they be sited elsewhere, leaving Rust Belt communities behind again? So far, the answer leaned toward the latter. New EV facilities were being built, but often in the South, where labor was cheaper and unions weaker. GM opened an EV battery plant in Tennessee, not Ohio. The workers who had spent careers making gasoline-powered cars were not automatically included in the electric future. This raised a fundamental environmental justice issue. The people who had borne the environmental costs of industrial production, the pollution, the health impacts, were not benefiting from the transition to cleaner technology. Instead, they were being left in economically and environmentally degraded landscapes while new opportunities emerged elsewhere. Environmental advocates and labor unions sometimes clashed over these issues. Environmentalists pushed for stricter regulations and faster transitions to clean energy. Workers worried those changes would cost jobs. But the conflict was often a false choice, created by a system that refused to ensure displaced workers were supported through transitions. A just transition would have meant investing in cleanup, retraining workers for green industries, and building new economic opportunities in places like Lordstown. It would have acknowledged that communities which powered American prosperity deserve support as the economy evolved. Instead, policy mostly ignored them, leaving workers and environmentalists to fight over scraps. The empty Lordstown plant symbolized this failure. It sat on land that needed environmental remediation, in a community that needed economic investment, representing an industry that needed transform. All three needs were connected, but addressing them required political will and resources that were not forthcoming. The environmental story of Lordstown was not separate from the economic and human story. They were intertwined. The pollution was the cost of the jobs. The health impacts were the price workers paid for their wages. The contaminated land was the legacy of prosperity that had moved on. Any honest reckoning with Lordstown's closure had to include this dimension. The factory had provided jobs, yes, but it had also extracted environmental costs that the community would bear for decades. Acknowledging that complexity did not diminish workers' suffering. It added layers, showing that the choices facing America were never simple, that trade-offs were real, and that cleaning up the past while building a better future required resources and commitment that went far beyond political speeches and corporate press releases. Part 9. The Mirror the Valley Holds Up. Lordstown's story is specific. One plant, one community, one set of circumstances. But it reflects patterns that extend across America and across decades. To see Lordstown clearly is to see the choices a nation makes about work, wealth, and who matters. The rise and fall of Lordstown Assembly traces the arc of post-war American capitalism. The plant opened during an era of relative labor power, when unions could negotiate meaningful concessions and manufacturing jobs provided middle-class stability. It closed during an era of corporate dominance, when companies could move production globally, automate aggressively, and face minimal consequences for destroying communities. This shift was not accidental or inevitable. It was a result of policy choices. Trade agreements that prioritized corporate profits over worker protections. Tax policies that rewarded offshoring and automation. labor laws that weakened unions and made organizing harder, financial deregulation that prioritized shareholder returns over all other considerations. Each choice, individually, seemed defensible or even necessary. Collectively, they created an economy where companies had every incentive to abandon places like Lordstown and no reason to stay. The market, often invoked as a neutral force, was actually the product of political decisions that tilted power decisively toward capital and away from labor. Workers at Lordstown were not victims of economic forces beyond human control. They were casualties of a system deliberately constructed to prioritize certain interests over others. GM did not have to close the plant. It could have kept it running at lower profitability. It could have invested in new products. It could have treated workers as stakeholders whose livelihoods mattered as much as shareholder dividends. But the system GM operated within rewarded none of those choices. Executives were compensated based on stock performance. Shareholders demanded maximum returns. Competitors in countries with lower labor costs undercut prices. Within that system, closing Lordstown was rational. That rationality, however, depended on ignoring or minimizing the human cost. This is a mirror Lordstown holds up. It shows what America values and what it does not. Workers who built the economy for decades were disposable. Communities that depended on industrial jobs were acceptable collateral damage. The wealth generated by their labor flowed upward to shareholders and executives, while costs of transition and decline were borne by those least able to afford them. The story also reveals the limitations of individualist solutions. Workers were told to retrain, to relocate, to adapt. Some could and did. But retraining for what? Most workers lacked the resources to relocate. The jobs available in the valley paid a fraction of what Lordstown had offered. Individual resilience, no matter how admirable, could not compensate for structural abandonment. Politicians from both parties contributed to the problem. Republicans championed deregulation and union busting, making workers more vulnerable. Democrats often supported trade deals that accelerated deindustrialization while offering inadequate support for displaced workers. Both parties failed to challenge the underlying logic that treated labor as a cost to minimize rather than a stake to protect. The result was communities like Lordstown left to cope with the wreckage while politicians moved on to the next issue. The anger that followed, expressed in votes for Trump, in skepticism toward institutions, in declining faith in democracy itself, was predictable. People who feel abandoned by the system do not defend it. Yet Lordstown also shows possibilities. The solidarity among workers, the resilience of community organizations, the refusal of many to simply accept their fate, these point toward different outcomes. If workers had more power, if unions were stronger, if policies prioritized employment and community stability, plants like Lordstown might have survived or transitioned rather than closed. Other countries managed industrial transitions more successfully. Germany maintained manufacturing employment through coordinated industrial policy, strong unions, and worker representation on corporate boards. Japan invested in workforce development and technological adaptation. Neither was perfect, but both demonstrated that deindustrialization was not inevitable, that policy choices mattered. America chose differently. It embraced a version of capitalism that prioritized flexibility and efficiency over stability and equity. That choice produced cheaper consumer goods and higher corporate profits. It also produced a Rust Belt, communities in permanent crisis, and a working class increasingly disconnected from the prosperity their labor created. The question facing America now is whether to continue down that path or make different choices. Lordstown cannot be brought back to what it was. The industry has changed. Automation and global supply chains are realities. But the principles at stake remain. Should workers have a voice in decisions that affect their lives? Should communities be protected from economic abandonment? Should wealth be distributed more fairly? Answering yes to those questions requires structural change. Strengthening labor laws, reforming trade policy, investing in industrial strategy, redistributing wealth through taxation and public spending. These are not easy changes. They require challenging powerful interests that benefit from the current system. But the alternative is more Lordstowns, more communities hollowed out, more workers discarded, more anger and instability. The choice is not between the past and the future, but between an economy that serves everyone and one that serves only those at the top. Lordstown holds up that mirror. What Americans see in it depends on whether they're willing to look honestly, to acknowledge what has been done, and to imagine what could be different. The plant sits empty, waiting. The workers have moved on or aged out. The community struggles. But the question remains, what kind of country do we want to be? Part 10. The future that could still be built. Empty buildings do not have to stay empty. Devastated communities do not have to remain devastated. But transformation requires more than hope and market forces. It requires deliberate investment, political will, and a recognition that some problems cannot be solved by private enterprise alone. Lordstown and the Mahoning Valley face a choice. They can continue to wait for the next company to arrive with promises, the next politician to offer sympathy, the next cycle of hope and disappointment. Or they can demand something different. Real investment, structural support, and a voice in their own future. Several models exist, though none are easy. One is aggressive public investment in new industries. The federal government could fund the development of advanced manufacturing in the valley, electric vehicle components, renewable energy equipment, battery production. This would require subsidies, infrastructure investment, and coordinated planning. It would also require accepting that some industries need public support to develop, particularly in regions abandoned by private capital. The Biden administration's infrastructure and climate bills included provisions for exactly this kind of investment, but the scale remains inadequate and implementation has been slow. Lordstown and similar communities need billions, not millions, over sustained periods. They need workforce development programs that actually lead to jobs, not just training certificates. They need guarantees that new facilities will employ locals at fair wages, not temporary workers or contractors. Another model involves worker ownership. When plants close, workers or communities could purchase them, converting them into cooperatives or employee-owned enterprises. This model has worked in other contexts, particularly in manufacturing and service industries. Worker owners have incentives to maintain operations, invest in training, and keep jobs local. They are less likely to close facilities for short-term profit maximization. Lordstown Motors and Foxconn both failed to deliver. But what if the workers themselves, supported by public investment and union resources, had taken ownership? What if the plant had been converted into a cooperative producing electric vehicles or components, with profits shared among worker owners? The model is not theoretical. Similar conversions have happened, though not often at Lordstown scale. A third approach involves diversification. The Valley's mistake was depending too heavily on a single industry. Economic resilience requires variety. Investments in education, healthcare, small business development, and tourism could create a more stable economic base. This is slower and less glamorous than landing a major manufacturer, but it is also more sustainable. The challenge is that diversification requires resources communities like Lordstown no longer have. Their tax bases have collapsed. Their populations are aging and declining. Private investment avoids them. Without substantial public support, diversification remains aspirational rather than achievable. All of these approaches require confronting a fundamental reality. The market alone will not save Lordstown. Private companies will only invest if they see profit potential. That potential is limited in regions with declining populations, aging infrastructure, and limited local demand. Reversing that decline requires public action that prioritizes social goals, employment, community stability, environmental remediation, over narrow profit calculations. This is where political will matters. Politicians who visit Lordstown need to do more than express sympathy. They need to deliver resources, change policies, and challenge the systems that created the crisis. That means supporting aggressive industrial policy, strengthening labor rights, reforming trade agreements, and redistributing wealth through taxation and spending. It also means listening to workers and residents. Too often, policy is designed by people in Washington or state capitals who have never lived in places like Lordstown. They do not understand the community's needs, its history, or its capabilities. Effective policy requires genuine participation, giving communities real power to shape their own futures. The obstacles are significant. Corporate lobbying resists policies that empower workers or constrain business decisions. Fiscal conservatives oppose public spending at the necessary scale. Political polarization makes it difficult to build coalitions around shared economic goals. And the attention span of national politics is short. Crises come and go, and Lordstown is no longer in the headlines. But obstacles are not the same as impossibility. Change happens when people organize, demand it, and refuse to accept the status quo. Labor unions, community organizations, and grassroots movements have won major victories in the past. The New Deal, civil rights legislation, environmental protections, all came from sustained organizing and political pressure, not from waiting for markets or politicians to act benevolently. Lordstown's workers and residents have agency. They can organize, demand investment, hold politicians accountable, and build coalitions with other communities facing similar challenges. The Rust Belt is not a collection of isolated failures, but a region with shared interests. Coordinated action across Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and other states could create political pressure that individual communities cannot generate alone. Young people in the Valley also have a role. Many have left, seeking opportunities elsewhere, but some have stayed or returned, committed to rebuilding. They bring new skills, perspectives, and energy. Supporting them with resources, infrastructure, and opportunities could be the foundation for a different future. Environmental remediation must be part of any revival. The contaminated sites, the degraded river, the pollution legacy, these need to be addressed not just for health and environmental reasons, but as economic development. Clean sites are more attractive to investors and healthier for residents. Federal Superfund money, state environmental funds, and corporate liability settlements should be directed toward comprehensive cleanup. Ultimately, Lordstown's future depends on whether America decides that places like it matter. Do communities that power the country for decades deserve support when industries change? Or are they simply collateral damage in an economic system that values efficiency over stability? The answer will be revealed not in speeches, but in budgets, policies, and sustained commitment. Lordstown could be revived, but it will take effort, resources, and a willingness to challenge the systems that destroyed it in the first place. The plant sits empty, the workers are scattered, but the possibility remains. The question is whether anyone with power will choose to act on it. Part 11, The Lessons Written in Rust. The lessons of Lordstown are not subtle. They are written in rusted steel, empty parking lots, and the faces of workers who gave their lives to a factory that gave them nothing in return. Yet somehow, those lessons remain unlearned, repeated with minor variations across other communities, other industries, other generations of workers. The first lesson is about power. Workers at Lordstown had power when their labor was essential and their unions were strong. They could strike, slow production, and force negotiations. As automation reduced their leverage and unions weakened, that power evaporated. The balance shifted entirely to corporate management, which could make unilateral decisions about closures, layoffs, and restructuring without meaningful worker input. Restoring worker power requires structural change, stronger labor laws, easier union organizing, worker representation on corporate boards, policies that make closure and offshoring costly enough to discourage them. None of this will happen without political pressure, and political pressure requires organization. The second lesson is about economic concentration. GM, at its peak, was not just a company but an institution that shaped entire regions. When one employer dominates an area, the community is vulnerable. Diversification is not just good economic policy. It is survival strategy. Regions that depend on single industries or employers live at their mercy. Encouraging diversification requires public investment in education, infrastructure, and support for small businesses. It requires patience. Building a diverse economy takes longer than landing one big factory. It also requires acknowledging that some regions may never fully recover their past prosperity and need support transitioning to new economic models. The third lesson is about time. Deindustrialization is not a sudden event, but a decades-long process. Lordstown did not close in 2019. It began dying in the 1980s, with each layoff, each automation upgrade, each shift in GM's priorities. By the time closure was announced, the outcome was almost inevitable. Intervention works best early, before crises become catastrophes. When plans start cutting shifts, that is when policy should respond, with investment, retraining, and planning. Waiting until closure is announced and then expressing sympathy is not policy. It is theater. The fourth lesson is about trust. Workers at Lordstown were promised security if they worked hard and stayed loyal. The company broke that promise. Politicians promised to fight for them. Those promises went unfulfilled. Startup companies promised revival. They failed or disappeared. Each broken promise deepened cynicism and eroded faith in institutions. Rebuilding trust requires delivering on commitments consistently and over time. It requires transparency, accountability, and treating workers as partners rather than costs. Trust, once lost, is difficult to regain. The damage from decades of broken promises will take decades to repair. The fifth lesson is about narratives. The story of Lordstown is often told as foreign competition or technological change, forces beyond human control. But those forces were mediated by human choices. Trade policy was negotiated. Tax laws were written. Labor regulations were weakened. Automation was deployed in specific ways to serve specific interests. Framing deindustrialization as inevitable obscures the choices that caused it and the different choices that could prevent future Lordstowns. Economic change is shaped by policy, and policy is shaped by politics. Nothing is truly inevitable. The sixth lesson is about visibility. Lordstown became nationally visible when Trump promised to save it and when it closed. But the years of slow decline, the thousands of small indignities workers faced, the gradual erosion of community, those were invisible. National attention focuses on dramatic moments, not ongoing crises. Making invisible suffering visible requires sustained effort, journalism, organizing, political advocacy. It requires resisting the media's preference for simple narratives and insisting on complexity. It requires centering the voices of those directly affected, not just politicians and executives. The seventh lesson is about cost. Lordstown's closure had a price, but who paid it? Not GM shareholders, who continued receiving dividends. Not executives, whose compensation remained high. Workers paid with their jobs. Families paid with economic insecurity. The community paid with population decline and lost tax revenue. The costs were socialized while profits had been privatized. Fair distribution of costs and benefits requires policy, severance requirements, community adjustment funds, corporate accountability for plant closures. Markets alone will not produce fair outcomes. Justice requires intervention. The eighth lesson is about memory. Lordstown's history is being forgotten. Even as similar stories play out elsewhere, workers who built the plant are dying. Records are lost. Buildings decay. Without deliberate effort to preserve this history, future generations will not understand what was lost, what was taken, and what could have been different. Memory work is political work. It resists the narrative that current arrangements are natural or inevitable. It shows that other arrangements existed, that workers once had more power, that communities once thrived on industrial labor. Preserving that memory keeps alive the possibility of reclaiming what was lost. The ninth lesson is about hope. Despite everything, many workers at Lordstown maintained hope that the plant would survive, that new jobs would come, that their community would recover. That hope, while often disappointed, was not naive. It was a refusal to accept defeat, a commitment to possibility. Hope is necessary but not sufficient. It must be coupled with clear-eyed analysis and strategic action. Hope without power is wishful thinking, but power without hope is cynicism. The challenge is holding both, seeing the world as it is while working to make it what it should be. The 10th lesson is that Lordstown is not unique. Across America, from textile towns in the Carolinas to mining communities in Appalachia to manufacturing cities in the Midwest, the same patterns repeat. Workers are promised stability, then abandoned. Communities are built around industries, then devastated when those industries leave. The specific details vary, but the underlying dynamic remains constant. Addressing this requires national policy, not just local interventions. industrial strategy, trade reform, labor rights, regional development. All of these must be coordinated. Piecemeal approaches will produce piecemeal results. Comprehensive change requires comprehensive policy. The lessons are there. Whether anyone learns them depends on whether those with power choose to look honestly at what Lordstown reveals. So far, the evidence is not encouraging, but the possibility remains. Each time another plant closes, another community struggles, another group of workers is discarded. The lessons become harder to ignore. Eventually, perhaps, they will be impossible to ignore. And then, maybe, something will change. Part 12. Responsibility and the Roads Forward. Assigning responsibility for Lordstown's closure is both essential and complicated. Multiple actors made choices that contributed to the outcome, and understanding those choices clarifies what must change. GM bears obvious responsibility. The company decided to close the plant, prioritizing profit margins over community stability. GM could have chosen differently, accepting lower returns, investing in new products, maintaining production despite competitive pressures. Other companies in other countries have made such choices. GM did not, because the system had operated within rewarded short-term profit maximization above all else. But GM's executives were not uniquely evil. They were responding to incentives created by shareholder capitalism, where stock price determines CEO compensation and activist investors demand cost-cutting. Blaming individuals without addressing the system that shaped their decisions is insufficient. Federal policymakers share responsibility. Trade agreements like NAFTA facilitated offshoring, making it easier and more profitable to move production to Mexico. Tax policies rewarded companies for closing domestic facilities. Labor laws weakened unions, reducing workers' ability to resist closures. Financial deregulation prioritized shareholder returns over stakeholder interests. Both parties contributed. Republicans championed deregulation and union busting. Democrats supported trade deals and failed to strengthen labor protections adequately. The bipartisan consensus around market-based solutions created conditions where plants like Lordstown became expendable. State and local officials bear some responsibility for failing to diversify the economy. Trumbull County and the Mahoning Valley depended too heavily on manufacturing, particularly automotive manufacturing. Efforts to attract other industries were minimal or ineffective. When the plant closed, there was no economic cushion. But local officials operated with limited resources and authority. They cannot control GM's decisions or federal trade policy. Blaming them for failing to prevent something largely beyond their control is unfair, though they could have been more proactive in pushing for diversification decades earlier. The UAW's role is complicated. The union won significant gains for workers: wages, benefits, pensions, work rules. It fought against closures and negotiated protections when possible. But the union also made concessions, accepting two-tier wage systems and flexible work rules that weakened solidarity and reduced its leverage. Some critics argue the UAW became too bureaucratic, too focused on maintaining relationships with management, too willing to accept decline rather than fight militantly. Others argue the union did the best it could within a system increasingly hostile to organized labor. Both perspectives contain truth. Workers themselves are blameless. They showed up, did their jobs, and played by the rules. They were promised security and betrayed. Any narrative that blames workers for demanding too much, for failing to adapt, for resisting change, is fundamentally unjust. The system failed them, not the reverse. The broader public also has a role. American consumers bought imports, choosing lower prices over supporting domestic manufacturing. Voters elected politicians who supported policies enabling deindustrialization. Pension funds and retirement accounts invested in companies that closed plants to boost returns. The connections between individual choices and collective outcomes were often invisible, but they existed. Recognizing collective responsibility does not mean everyone is equally responsible. Executives and policymakers wielded far more power than workers or consumers. But change requires broad engagement, not just holding a few powerful actors accountable. What, then, should be done? The road forward requires action at multiple levels. At the federal level, Industrial policy must prioritize employment and community stability. This means strengthening labor laws to make organizing easier and give workers more power-forming trade agreements to include strong labor and environmental protections, creating financial incentives for domestic production and penalties for offshoring investing in workforce development, infrastructure, and regional economic planning, establishing adjustment funds for communities affected by plant closures, reforming corporate governance to include worker representation and limit shareholder primacy. At the state level, Ohio and other Rust Belt states should invest in education and training aligned with emerging industry support cooperative and employee ownership models, prioritize environmental remediation of contaminated industrial sites, develop regional strategies for economic diversification, strengthen safety nets for displaced workers. At the local level, communities like Lordstown need resources to address immediate needs: food assistance, healthcare, housing support platforms for workers and residents to participate in planning their economic future, support for grassroots organizations working on economic development, preservation of history and memory to inform future action. At the individual level, Americans can support unions and worker organizing, choose politicians based on labor and economic policies, prioritize domestic products when feasible and affordable, educate themselves about the connections between consumer choices and labor conditions, resist narratives that blame workers for structural problems. None of these actions alone will fix the problems Lordstown represents, but collectively, sustained over time, they can begin to shift the balance toward an economy that values work and community alongside profit. The challenge is political will. The policies needed to support places like Lordstown threaten powerful interests. Corporations resist labor reforms. Free trade advocates oppose protectionism. Fiscal conservatives oppose public spending. Overcoming that resistance requires organizing and sustained pressure. Lordstown's workers, if still organized, if connected to broader labor movements, if supported by progressive politicians and social movements, could be part of that pressure, but they cannot do it alone. The fight for manufacturing communities is part of a larger fight about what kind of economy and society America will have. The choices made in response to Lordstown will shape future outcomes. Will similar closures be accepted as inevitable, or will they trigger policy changes? Will workers be discarded, or will they be supported? Will communities be abandoned, or will they be rebuilt? The answers depend on collective choices, not market forces. Lordstown was destroyed by decisions humans made. Different decisions could produce different outcomes. Responsibility for making those decisions rests with all of us. Part 13, Ghosts on the Assembly Line. The plant is quiet now. The assembly line, once moving at 60 vehicles per hour, sits frozen. The machinery that stamped metal, welded frames, and painted bodies is idle. Dust settles on equipment that once ran 24 hours a day. The building holds a ghost of 1,000,000 shifts, 1,000,000 conversations, 1,000,000 moments of labor that built the cars that carried America through decades. Walk through the plant, if you could gain access, if security were not patrolling, and you would see remnants, tool marks on concrete floors, stains from spilled oil and coolant, fading safety signs warning about machinery that no longer moves, graffiti left by workers on their final days, messages declaring they were there, they mattered, they will not be forgotten. In the parking lot, weeds push through cracks in the pavement. Spaces that once held thousands of cars now hold nothing. The employee entrance, where workers punch in every day, is locked. The loading docks, where finished vehicles were driven onto transport trucks, are empty. The whole complex feels like a museum, except no one is preserving it. It is simply abandoned, waiting for its next purpose or its final demolition. Former workers sometimes visit. They park outside the fence and stare at the building where they spent years, sometimes decades. They remember where they worked, what their station looked like, who they worked alongside. They remember the noise, the constant roar of machinery, the hiss of pneumatic tools, the warning beeps of forklifts. Now there's only silence, broken occasionally by wind or passing cars. Mike, who transferred to Tennessee, drives past when he visits family. "I can't help it," he said. "I know it's just a building, but it was my life. Everything I did, everything I achieved happened in there. Seeing it empty feels like someone died. Sarah, who stayed in the valley and works at a warehouse, avoids the plant. It's too painful, she explained. I spent 20 years there, had friends, had a routine, had a purpose. Now it's nothing. I can't look at it without feeling like I failed, even though I know I didn't. Jim, who was forced into early retirement, drives by more often. I'm angry, he said. That place made billions for GM. We built quality cars. We did everything they asked, and they just walked away. I want to see it rot. I want it to stand there as proof of what they did to us. The emotions are raw, contradictory, deeply personal. The plant is more than a building. It is a symbol of promises broken, of lives built and then disrupted, of a social contract that turned out to be more fragile than anyone imagined. Inside Ohio, Lordstown has become shorthand for economic betrayal. Political speeches reference it. Union organizers cite it as an example of why labor power matters. Community activists point to it as evidence of the need for different economic policies. The plant's physical presence reinforces these symbolic meanings. As long as it stands, it reminds people what happened and what could happen again. Nationally, Lordstown is one of many closed plants, one of many devastated communities. The specifics blur together. Lordstown, Flint, Gary, countless textile towns, mining communities, industrial cities. Each has its own story, but the pattern is the same. Capital moves, workers suffer, communities struggle, and the system continues unchanged. Yet Lordstown's visibility, its proximity to major media markets, and its political significance have given it more attention than most closures receive. It became a national story in ways many similar closures did not. That visibility is both a burden and an opportunity. It keeps the pressure on, keeps the issue alive, but it also invites exploitation, as politicians and companies use Lordstown for publicity without delivering real solutions. The workers who built cars at Lordstown were not asking for much. Decent wages, stable employment, the ability to provide for their families and retire with dignity. These were not extravagant demands. They were the basic expectations of the post-war social contract. The deal that said if you worked hard, you would be okay. That contract is broken. Lordstown is proof. The question now is whether it can be repaired or whether American workers will simply have to accept a future of insecurity, low wages, and disposability. The ghosts on the assembly line, the memories of work, the traces of presence, the lives that pass through that building haunt not just the plant but the country. They ask questions America has not answered. What do we owe each other? What responsibilities come with power? What happens to people when they are no longer economically useful? The plant cannot answer these questions. It can only stand as a monument to the fact that they have not been answered, that the systems creating Lordstown's fate remain intact, and that more communities will face the same reckoning unless something fundamental changes. The silence in the plant is not peaceful. It is a silence of abandonment, a potential unfulfilled, of a promise that was made and broken. It is a silence of ghosts who worked and dreamed and built a future that was taken from them. And it will remain silent until someone, somewhere with the power to act, decides that places like Lordstown and people like its workers deserve better than to be written off as the cost of doing business. Part 14. What we choose to remember. History is not neutral. It is written by choices. What to preserve, what to emphasize, what to forget. Lordstown's story could disappear, absorbed into vague narratives about globalization and economic change. Or it could be remembered clearly, taught deliberately, and used to inform future choices. Several efforts are underway to preserve Lordstown's history. Local historians are collecting oral history from workers, recording their experiences before they are lost. Union archives contain documents, photographs, and records of negotiations and strikes. Regional museums have acquired artifacts, tools, uniforms, pieces of equipment that tell the story of industrial labor. But preservation requires resources. Museums need funding. Archives need maintenance. Oral history projects need staff and technology. In a region struggling economically, these priorities compete with immediate needs: food, housing, healthcare. The question becomes, can a community afford to remember when it is still struggling to survive? The answer must be yes, because memory shapes possibility. Without understanding what happened at Lordstown and why, future generations will not have the context to make different choices. They will not understand that industrial decline was not inevitable, that policy shaped outcomes, and that different policies could produce different results. Schools in the Valley have opportunities to teach this history. Students could learn about the plant's opening, the labor struggles of the 1970s, the impact of trade policy, the automation debate, and the closure. They could interview family members who worked there, visit the site, and analyze what happened through economic, political, and social lenses. This education would serve multiple purposes. It would honor workers' contributions. It would provide context for current economic conditions. It would develop critical thinking about policy, corporate power, and labor rights. And it would counter narratives that blame workers or portray deindustrialization as inevitable. Nationally, Lordstown should be part of a broader conversation about industrial history. Museums like the Henry Ford Museum preserve early industrial innovation, celebrating American ingenuity and productivity. But where are the museums documenting industrial decline, worker displacement, and community devastation? Those stories are equally important. A national museum or memorial dedicated to deindustrialization could be powerful. It could document not just Lordstown, but Flint, Gary, textile towns, mining regions, all the places that powered America's rise and then were abandoned. It could center workers' voices, preserve their stories, and educate visitors about the human cost of economic policy. Such an institution would be controversial. Some would see it as anti-business or overly political. But museums are always political. Choosing what to commemorate is a political act. Currently, the choice is to commemorate innovation and success while ignoring or minimizing the costs. A museum that corrects that imbalance would provide necessary perspective. Digital preservation also matters. Websites, documentaries, podcasts, and social media can reach audiences traditional institutions cannot. Projects that document Lordstown's story in accessible formats can educate people who will never visit Ohio, building a broader constituency for policies that support manufacturing communities. Artists have a role too. Films, plays, novels, visual art, all can tell Lordstown's story in ways that resonate emotionally and stick in memory. Bruce Springsteen sang about deindustrialization in places like Youngstown. More artists should follow, creating work that makes these stories visible and powerful. The challenge is ensuring these representations are accurate and respectful. Worker stories should not be exploited for emotional impact or simplified into narratives that serve outside agendas. The people who lived through Lordstown's closure should have input into how their experiences are remembered and portrayed. Memory work is also about correcting the record. Narratives that blame workers for demanding too much, that portray unions as problems, that frame deindustrialization as inevitable, these need to be challenged with facts. Research, journalism, and scholarship can provide counter-narratives grounded in evidence. For example, research shows that wage demands were not the primary driver of plant closures. Corporate decisions about where to invest, how to deploy automation, and which markets to prioritize matter more. Trade policy and tax incentives for offshoring played major roles. Blaming workers obscures these structural factors. Similarly, unions did not price themselves out of jobs. Union plants remained productive and profitable. Companies closed them because even higher profits were available elsewhere. The problem was not union wages, but a system that rewarded maximizing profit regardless of social cost. Correcting these narratives matters because they shape policy. If people believe workers were responsible for job losses, they will support policies that weaken labor further. If they understand the real causes, they might support policies that protect communities and empower workers. Lordstown's memory should also include lessons about corporate accountability. GM received billions in federal bailout money during the 2008 crisis. Taxpayers saved the company. A few years later, GM closed Lordstown. That sequence, public money rescuing a corporation that then abandons the public, should be remembered and should inform future bailout conditions. Environmental memory is also important. The pollution Lordstown and other industrial sites created will affect the valley for generations. Documenting that pollution, its health impacts, and the cost of remediation should be part of the historical record. It provides context for current environmental justice debates and informs future industrial policy. Finally, memory must be about the future, not just the past. Lordstown's story should inspire action. It should motivate people to organize, to demand better policies, to hold corporations and politicians accountable. Memory without action is nostalgia. Memory that inspires action is power. The plant itself, if preserved in some form, could serve this purpose, not as a working factory. That ship has likely sailed, but as an educational site. Tours, exhibits, and programs could teach visitors about industrial history, labor struggles, and economic policy. The building could be a classroom, a memorial, and a call to action all at once. But if the plant is demolished, the history must still be preserved through other means. Either way, the choice to remember or forget will shape what comes next. Communities that forget their history are doomed to repeat it. Communities that remember have the chance to learn, to organize, and to change course. Lordstown's workers, their labor, their struggles, and their suffering deserve to be remembered, not as victims in a tragic but inevitable story, but as people who did essential work, who fought for justice, and who were failed by systems that prioritize profit over humanity. Their memory is a warning, a lesson, and a demand that things be different. Whether that demand is heard depends on the choices we make about what to preserve, what to teach, and what to fight for. Part 15, the choice that still matters. The Lordstown plant still stands for now. The machinery inside is idle. The parking lots are empty. The community around it continues to struggle. But the story is not over. The choices being made today will determine what happens next, not just to Lordstown, but to countless other communities facing similar threats. The choice is not complicated, though it is difficult. America can continue prioritizing corporate profits, short-term efficiency, and shareholder returns above all else. Or it can choose to value work, community, and human dignity. The first path leads to more Lordstowns. The second requires structural change that powerful interests will resist. Workers at Lordstown did not fail. The system failed them. They showed up every day, built quality vehicles, and followed the rules. They were promised stability in exchange for loyalty. The promise was broken, not by them, but by corporations and policymakers who decided their jobs and their communities were expendable. Recognizing this is essential. Narratives that blame workers for job losses, by demanding too much, by resisting change, by failing to compete, are both factually wrong and morally offensive. They shift responsibility from those who made the decisions to those who suffered the consequences. The real question is whether Americans will demand accountability and change. Will communities organize to fight for industrial policy that protects jobs? Will workers rebuild union power that can resist plant closures? Will voters elect politicians who prioritize labor over capital? Will citizens recognize that their own economic security is connected to that of manufacturing workers in Ohio? The answers are not yet clear. Political will for major change remains limited. Corporate power is entrenched. The media often treats deindustrialization as old news, but moments of possibility still arise. New generations of workers are organizing. Climate policy creates opportunities for industrial investment. Political coalitions are forming around economic justice. Lordstown could be part of a turning point, or it could be one more forgotten casualty. The difference depends on whether people choose to care, to act, and to keep fighting until something changes. The workers who lost their jobs at Lordstown cannot wait forever. They are aging. Their savings are running out. Their health is declining under the stress of insecurity. Time matters. Every year without action is another year of suffering, another generation of young people who leave and never return, another step toward permanent decline. But even if Lordstown itself cannot be saved, its story can still matter. It can be a rallying point, a clear example of what goes wrong when corporate power goes unchecked and workers have no voice. It can motivate organizing, inform policy debates, and inspire resistance. The empty plant is a monument, whether anyone intended it to be. It monumentalizes abandonment, betrayal, and the human cost of prioritizing profit. It stands as evidence that the system is broken and that fixing it requires more than market forces and corporate goodwill. What comes next for Lordstown is uncertain. The building might be demolished, repurposed, or left to decay. The community might slowly recover, stabilize in poverty, or continue declining. The workers who once filled the plant will age and die, and eventually, no one will remain who remembers what it was like to work there. But the lessons will remain if we choose to learn them. The patterns will continue if we choose to ignore them. The choice is ours, not as isolated individuals, but as a society capable of collective action, policy change, and demanding better from those in power. Lordstown asks us to decide what kind of country we want to be. One where workers are disposable, where communities can be abandoned, where wealth flows upward while costs flow down, or one where labor has value, where communities are protected, where economic progress includes everyone, not just those at the top. The factory cannot answer that question. Politicians' speeches cannot answer it. Only action can answer it. Sustained organizing, policy changes, shifts in power. The work is hard, the obstacles are real, and success is not guaranteed. But the alternative is accepting more Lordstowns, more devastated communities, more broken promises, and more workers left behind. The assembly line is silent. The workers have gone. The building waits. But the story is not finished. Every choice made from this point forward writes the next chapter. Whether that chapter is about continued decline or genuine renewal depends on what we choose to remember, what we choose to fight for, and whether we choose to act while there is still time to make a difference. The ghosts of Lordstown Assembly are watching. They ask us, what will you do? What will you demand? What future will you fight for? The answers we give will shape not just Ohio's Mahoning Valley, but the fate of working communities across America. The choice is before us. The time to make it is now.